I want you to close your eyes and concentrate on a question. And that question is, what is the earliest memory that you can recall? I ask this question because first memories and just memories in general are something I find to be a very interesting phenomenon. According to a 2014 study, roughly 25% of people reported their earliest memory being one of mental or physical trauma. In a later study conducted in 2018, 40% of participants went on record with a first memory that was very likely fictitious. So when I asked you to recall your earliest memory, there were 40% of you who had something pop in your mind that isn't even real. Once you realize that, a whole different onslaught of questions start to pile up, the most prominent being, if reality didn't craft that memory, what did? Was it a story fed to you by your family so many times that it manifested itself? Was it something you saw in a piece of media when you were very young and inserted yourself into? Or did your brain just conjure it up out of thin air? Although this rabbit hole brings out a plethora of avenues to travel down in regards to the greater ramifications of memory distortion, the second question, and the one that I want to permanently shift the attention to, is this. Taking all of that information into account, how malleable are your memories? When that moment of trauma is replaying over and over in your head at 3 a.m, causing you to sob uncontrollably into the corner of your pillow, how has that memory been altered throughout the years, if at all? And what does that say about you? Flashback to May 31st, 2019. I'm sitting alone in my basement finishing up one of my final assignments for one of my final classes of my final semester at university. Things were going surprisingly well in almost all aspects of my everyday life. For the first time during my stint there, I had found a group of friends with similar interests that I would carry with me into the future. I had an internship where I was a videographer and editor for AAU basketball tournaments and personal hoop mixtapes. I also had a blossoming relationship with a wonderful girl that I had a great deal of feelings for. She was away in Chicago attending a concert for an artist that she loved. She even invited me to come with her, but due to my intense social anxiety disorder, pit-based concerts aren't something that I'm usually up for. Yet, while I was finishing up my part for my group project on the impact of independent publishing and e-commerce, I couldn't help but feel sad. Sure, it was beneficial to get my work done ahead of time, and yes, I do have a gripping fear of my 6'4" self trampling someone in a mosh pit and ruining the vibe, but somehow, some way, I still wanted to be there. Even though everything inside of my brain was saying otherwise, the thought of being there with her was far more appealing than being in my bedroom alone. I gradually finished the project and decided to watch something in order to take my mind off of these unfamiliar emotions. When there's not a specific release for me to watch, the method I use to choose a film to watch is by choosing the most interesting poster and going into it completely blind. Naturally, I found some criminally underviewed gems and some complete stinkers using this technique, but it always ends up being intriguing. At this point, I had cycled through titles for about 5 minutes to no avail until a sideways close-up of a girl soaked in a VHS filter came up on screen. If there are two things that I'm a sucker for, it's a pretty face and VHS filters. So I made up my mind, curled up with some popcorn, and commenced my viewing of the movie titled Starfish. The film tells the story of a woman named Aubrey who is smack dab in the middle of grieving the recent death of her best friend Grace, and she just so happens to be doing so in an end-of-the-world situation that only she can decipher through a series of mixtapes said best friend left behind for her. Starfish is a horror film, in the most basic sense of the word, as there are horror elements in it with impeccable gore and brilliant creature designs to match, but it falls more so under the metaphorical horror subgenre that films like The Babadook and Hereditary have popularized in the modern day. The difference here is that Starfish doesn't act as a horror film, but more as a drama, if anything. Most of the film switches out intense scenes of thrills and chills with introspective and existential monologues, or complete and utter silence. And although that may sound infuriating to a lot of people, as the drastically polarizing reviews on Letterboxd would indicate, after finishing it in the waning hours of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not only was it the most beautiful horror film that I had ever seen, sliding in just above my favorite Moorhead and Benson film Spring, but the messages about grief and forgiveness spoke to me in such a way that was like poetry, for lack of a better term. One of my biggest gripes with Hollywood is that it isn't able to portray grief on screen properly, so it makes sense why a random film that I stumbled across one night with no expectations would seemingly master it. Contrary to what every sappy rom-dram that gets shoved in our face from companies like Lionsgate would like you to believe, grief is selfish, and that is completely okay. Grief is filled with equal amounts of sadness, anger, and guilt, and that dichotomy is often forgone for the classic sad all the time trope that grieving on screen has become. And as all these thoughts kept flowing through my head, all I wanted to do was talk about them with her. All I wanted was to have her next to me and tell her all of my thoughts and feelings, and have her tell me everything about the concert she had attended and how her trip to Chicago was. And that was the exact moment that I realized that I loved her. Maybe it was Starfish. Maybe it was the natural progression of a relationship. Maybe it was a combination of the two. But something pushed me into a state of mind that I hadn't ever been in before. Love. It was like my mind was possessed and it couldn't stop racing. So I did what I usually do whenever I'm in a situation like that. I wrote. I opened my notes app and I started writing her a letter about Starfish and everything it made me feel in regards to our relationship and how I really loved her. About a half an hour after I had finished writing, I got a call from her and she sounded very intense. She told me that she wanted to see me on her way back, and since we lived an hour apart, she would be passing through anyways. I agreed and we decided to meet in the parking lot of a grocery store. Combining the fact that she wasn't a very affectionate person and she seemed hesitant to commit to a relationship not but 1 month prior, I was freaking out. I had just come to the revelation that I loved her, and now I was being asked to meet up for what seemed like a serious talk. Eventually, after a couple hours of my stomach flipping over and over again, the time came to leave, so I did. I got there first and she arrived about 10 minutes later. We both got into my car, considering it was a bit bigger than hers, and after the usual small talk, we just sat there, daring the other to make the first move. After what seemed like at least an eternity, I pulled out my phone and I read her exactly what I had written. I let go of all my anxiety and I just did it. When I finished, she pulled me in for a kiss and told me the reason she wanted to meet up with me is because she missed me at the concert. On the drive home, all she did was think of me, and she finished by saying that she also indeed loved me. For the next 15 minutes before we had to leave to get some sleep before work the next day, we just sat there in silence, holding hands and looking at the stars through my sunroof. She had her head nuzzled into the crick of my neck, and in that moment, the only thing that I could think of was how I hoped that this feeling would last forever. It's June 14th, 2021. I'm sitting in the same basement 2 years later, which has been packed up and left completely barren. Every friend that I had made in university had filtered their ways out of my life. I lost my best friend of the bunch, who I considered my best friend for a year or so, about 4 months ago over a constant stream of problems. Even though I did graduate, the internship didn't end up leading anywhere, and that relationship with that girl that I loved, and eventually moved in with, had ended 2 months ago, on our 2-year anniversary. The split was amicable, until I found out some information that made it much less amicable. Although I was moving on to a much greater venture, which myself in the current day can confirm has been one of the greatest blessings of my life, there was still a lot of regret and hatred that I was holding on to. I had been betrayed on multiple different occasions by people that I held very close to me, and in the midst of doing so, I lost a part of myself. I just didn't know what that part was. After I threw those thoughts to the side, I made my way up into the living room, which was also desolate, and popped open my 6-year-old laptop once again to look for something to watch. When I opened up my letterboxd, I saw that one of the people I followed had just finished watching, you guessed it, Starfish. At this point in time, it's one of my favorite films ever. I had watched it 5 times in about 2 years, and it was such a linchpin in my relationship with my ex that she bought me the Blu-ray for one of my birthdays. I was feeling in a contemplative mood, which is the feeling a viewing of Starfish usually thrived on, so I launched it and... Have you ever watched a film in one mindset on your first viewing, and you think that you get what you need out of it, and then you watch it again in a completely different mindset, and you come to a completely different understanding of the film, and your mind is just blown? I sat there in the middle of an empty living room as the credits rolled with Ekimuk by Siguros echoing in my head, and I thought to myself, so this is what it feels like to have a breakthrough. The conflict of Starfish on a purely surface level is a young woman trying to cut off a signal that could potentially send more ethereal creatures to Earth. Of course, as I previously mentioned, the film doesn't only work on a surface level. On a metaphorical level, the conflict of Starfish is a young woman coming to terms with her grief and the regrettable things she has done in her life, specifically cheating on her boyfriend, Edward. Throughout the film, the same memory keeps popping up, which is of her stripping down on a beach in the presumed act of cheating. She keeps attempting to suppress it, even going as far as to intervene in her own dream and drown the supposed guy she was cheating with. But that doesn't change anything. Eventually, in the culminating scene of the movie, she finds the final tape with a signal that Grace had left behind, and she broadcasts them over the radio station, thinking she has closed the door for the aliens to come through. On the contrary, as a survivor later tells her over her walkie-talkie, instead of closing the door, she has completely opened it, insinuating that the entities now have free reign to transport to Earth as they please. Upon learning this, Aubrey notices a message that Grace has inscribed on the tapes: forgive and forget. Then, in one of the best ending scenes in the history of cinema, she walks outside to see a half circle of blood being pulled out of the ground. Accepting what she cannot change, she steps into the circle, and once she gets hit by a drop of the blood, she finally lets go. All of the memories, both good and bad, of her relationship with Edward start flashing across the screen, but the one that's been haunting her does not. For the entirety of the film, Aubrey was focusing on pushing away the memories and ideas of her past, in fear of having to accept the fact that she did some very bad things. This stuck her in this everlasting loop of self-hatred and negativity. She thought the answer was closing off those memories, but the true solution was accepting that those things happened, forgiving herself, and letting all of those memories and feelings come flooding back. You don't close the door, you open it. No matter how hard I had tried, the memories of being hurt were always rising to the top. No matter how much I tried to cut out everything that even slightly reminded me of them, the loathing would remain dominant. I was doing it all wrong. I had been looking at those relationships as mistakes, things that I wished I hadn't experienced, when in all reality, there were more good memories of those relationships than bad ones. Instead of pushing them to the recesses of my mind where they controlled things behind the scenes, I decided to let them out in the open, where I could confront them head on. While it did hurt to remember the things that she did to me, or the things that she didn't do, it also made me smile when I thought of our Mario Kart tournaments, or our trips to Chicago together, or the night under the stars when we told each other I love you. Ultimately, I can't control what happened in my past and the things that happened to me, but I can control how I remember it. I shut my laptop, locked up the house, and got in my car. I drove to the McDonald's next door and ordered a large cherry Sprite, and then I drove to the grocery store parking lot and sat there, looking up into the sky through the sunroof. So now whenever I remember that parking lot, even though I might be sad reminiscing about a love that didn't pan out in the way that I would have hoped, I'll also remember watching one of my final Michigan sunsets, ready to embark on an adventure beyond my wildest dreams. From that moment on, I've dug up a lot of buried trauma that I had lodged in the back of my brain to rot away forever. I'm a completely different person than I was 9 months ago, and I'm forever grateful that Starfish helped me open that door. And if you're at home struggling with similar demons and issues, I implore you to watch it. Perhaps it will even inspire you to open the door yourself.